Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to discuss with you further about the third and final key battle we'll be exploring for the Western Front, which is the Battle of Amiens. We covered in the previous video the build-up and current situation by early 1918, so if you're not already, do make sure you head back and check that out before watching this video. This video is going to concern us with the actual German attack now, their final spring offensive, and how the Allies will respond to that as we get into Battle of Amiens and beyond. As always, do remember that this is a lesson catered towards the student level, so we have some key knowledge involved for us here, and we're dedicated towards practicing our historical skills. With that in mind, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So, as we said in the last video, the German situation is going to become quite dire quite quickly. They have to act soon, otherwise the Americans are going to arrive and the British are going to launch their Allied offensive and break the entire Western Front before the Germans can have a chance to defend it. So, what exactly is the plan? What are the Germans going to do? Well, let's find out. So the Germans' plan was to once again rely on the likes of Ludendorff and Hindenburg to try and generate some success. The idea the gentleman came up with was a very simple plan, which was to try and attack. There's one key problem though. Yes, they have a slight numerical advantage, but this is a gamble. Committing to such a large offensive would mean they're going to sacrifice any advantage they still hold in defence. They've become masters, remember. They've held this front against relentless offensives from various attacks all the way out of the Western conflict. But now, by sacrificing their advantage in defence, they're going to leave themselves vulnerable to a potential Allied counterattack. Still, they see this as their only chance for victory. They've got the Eastern Front troops moving in. They know the Americans aren't yet here on the Western Front. If they're going to have their own breakthrough now, this is the time to try and achieve it. So, what is the attack? Well, it's Operation Michael. This is the first of several mini operations they're going to launch, but Operation Michael is the main one that they conduct. This starts on March 21st, 1918. The Germans really throw everything at the Allied forces. It's an all-out attack. They throw their stormtroopers. They commit storming barrages with their artillery. They even launch gas attacks. They put to use the German A7V tank, or the Panzerwagens, and they also unleash the biggest mass infantry assault that the Western Front has seen from the Germans since all the way back in 1914 with their offensive at the River Marne. Really was a series of powerful blows. They first struck in the centre, where they attacked the Fifth Army. Gough here only had 12 divisions at his command, trying to cover a vast 42-mile wide front. However, Hager justified this, as he believed that amassing the majority of the British forces in the north around Ypres would prevent them losing the Channel ports. Again, remember, Britain's an empire. It relies on its navy. It's also worth noting the navy's doing a lot right now to starve the Germans out. They're committing a massive naval blockade. They're really robbing them of any supplies they're trying to get in as the fronts are shrinking for the Germans. So, of course, maintaining that control of the ports is going to be a big advantage. It's also worth noting that these battalions now have about 30 machine guns each, preparing themselves to defend their positions. This shows a big evolution compared to how back in 1914 most battalions only had no more than 2 machine guns to use. However, Ludendorff did not want to give up. He launched another offensive called Operation Georgette in April. This time he decided to attack that defensive position at the north, and it was quite successful. They retook Passchendaele, which they had lost in 1917, and it became so dire that General Haig had to issue back to the walls order, imploring his men not to give up. Whether this speech proved successful or not did not matter. What was known is that the British defences managed to hold firm and the offensive was stalled to a halt by April 30th. Ludendorff refused to give up though. He knew the Americans were coming, many already arriving on the front. So he launched one final attack, this time in the south at the French, pushing them all the way back to the River Marne by July 18th. However, ironically, one thing they lacked to really rout the defences was cavalry. I've not mentioned cavalry much in this video series because, truth be told, although they were present on the front, they never really had many notable offensives. Their success was much more notable in the likes of Africa, the Middle East, and on the Eastern Front. However, now was the time where cavalry would have really been useful. Cavalry divisions were the main way to rout an enemy force. Once you had gained that initial advantage, cavalry could swoop in round the flanks, come out from the back and the rears, and capture and disrupt any retreating action that was occurring. However, many of these cavalry divisions for the Germans were still on the Eastern Front, and there were reports that several of the men had actually deserted while travelling from there towards the west, meaning that when these breaches were happening at the Marne and other places on the Western Front, the Germans simply could not rout the Allied forces. Plus, as well, their tanks, which were meant to be the evolution of cavalry, were still quite clunky. They were still very inferior towards the British designs. The Germans, even though they managed to capture some British tanks and repurpose them for their own use, just still weren't up to the job. The offensive was running out of steam, it ran out of momentum, and all really burned dry for them. It also did not help that now the American troops were in full force. They were under General John Pershing, and they joined the lines, with roughly 10,000 now arriving every day once we got to July. They also committed to a decisive defense at Belleau Wood. This was a bloody battle where the American troops suffered many casualties, but it did halt the German advance and help those French soldiers in the south protect and defend the River Marne. The French had also managed to hold their ground as well, and even got some impressive counter-attacks under the command of Ferdinand Foch. The dogged Allied defence had truly outmatched the German attack. Ludendorff's forces were spent, the momentum of the offensive completely gone. The Germans, they breached about 40 miles, which was, on paper, the most ground they'd achieved since way back in 1914. However, they did not score a knockout blow. They'd suffered 350,000 casualties to the British and French and Americans roughly 330,000. But all in all, for all their sacrifice, it did not work. They were burnt out, and it was now Haig and the Allied forces' turn to strike back. How exactly will the British and the Allies respond? Well, since December 1917 and July 1918, the British and Allied forces have been developing a new plan to try and win the war once and for all. It started with this idea of a combined arms offensive or combined arms battle. Elements of this idea have been demonstrated in prior campaigns before. Hopefully, you remember a few of them. We saw the use of the creeping barrage, combining artillery and infantry together for mass offensive attacks. We saw the use of bombing campaigns and mines, coupled infantry attacks and the likes of Arras. We also saw the use of infantry, artillery, and tanks used together at Cambrai. But combined arms battle, it still wasn't a fully tested idea. That the generalship wasn't really sure what exactly it was and if it would truly work. It took the genius of not a British commander, not a French commander, but actually an Australian commander, the gentleman here on the screen, John Monash. He fully developed this idea of a combined arms battle at the Battle of Hamel in 1918. Monash understood that the war of movement that they'd all dreamed about back in 1914 simply had not occurred because it relied on speed, and speed had been lost because the German defences, such as their machine guns, their trenches, their pillboxes, and the use of high salients, had prevailed. They'd proved too difficult for this old method of attacks: cavalry charges, frontal infantry attacks, human wave motion, stationary bombardments. They simply weren't strong enough to defeat them. However, the British and Allied forces have really evolved since 1914. By the time we get here to 1918, we had seen some significant changes. We now had tanks, which had become superior with their armour and firepower in replacing cavalry. We had infantry attacks that now focused on raids and skirmishing more so than basic walking in line like at the Somme. We had our bombardments that had really evolved with artillery, such as the creeping barrage, improved timing, improved shells as well that were more precise and actually detonated more times than not when they landed, and also provided some key protection for the troops as well. It's also worth noting we also have the Air Force as well, the Royal Flying Corps. Again, we've not touched on them much in this series, but they're a very vital force we shouldn't overlook. They could do some incredible reconnaissance. Many now had Vickers machine guns put to them. One I do want to note is the Vickers Tempest that really came to the fore in January and February of 1918. We also have them now able to drop supplies forward, which is a game changer for attack. You imagine your troops, they run forward and they burn through all their ammunition, all their packs. What if the planes can now drop supplies in the trenches they captured? They could use those to resupply, go over the trenches, leapfrog, and attack again. This was now all possible. It's also worth remembering as well, we had a numerical advantage coming. We had a big force here. No longer was this a small expeditionary force of 80,000 soldiers like it was back in 1914. This was a full-blown army. We had about 1 million men for the British. We still had the French. Got all the Americans churning into the front by the time we enter 1918. And the wider Empire troops were finally here. Monash's troops from Australia. We have John Curry's troops from Canada. It's all really here. It's all coming together like a big jigsaw, a big puzzle. That's all finally going to work. So when Monash tested this idea at Hamel, it proved a decisive success. He only used a small force by the Western Front standing, about 7,000 Australian and American infantry. But the combination of the tanks, the artillery, the planes, the fast-moving skirmishers and infantry, they secured all the objectives Monash had planned out. How fast did they do it? Was it a week? Was it a day? It was 93 minutes. Think about that. 93 minutes. What a stunning victory. This is incredible success. How have they done this? Well, it's like we say, they pulled off this combined arms battle to incredible success. Now, of course, we don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. As impressive as this is only a small scale offensive, 7,000 soldiers. Would this work on a wider front? Well, General Rawlinson, and he proposed to Haig that maybe a combined arms battle would work if they put it across the whole front and put it to use. It would work if they just did it on a large scale. The template at Hamel had been set. The summer offensive was secured. Haig had agreed that the summer offensive was going to be a combined arms battle across the entire Western Front. They were going to do what the Germans had just done to them. They were going to throw absolutely everything at the Germans. A massive combination of British, American, French, and Dominion forces with all their technology, all their tactics, all their lessons, all their experience, finally ready to use. Is this going to succeed at Amiens? Well, that's what we're going to find out in the final part of this series. We have learned a lot over these past battles, but now it's time to find out how it's all going to end. How will World War One end for the British and Allied troops? Stay tuned to find out. Thank you as always for watching. I hope you found this series insightful. Do join me for our final lesson when it is released. This is History with Sire. Thank you for listening.